Hey guys, tonight we are diving into one of the most powerful and controversial stories in the world of self-development. We're talking about a name that has become synonymous with success, a man whose ideas have been called the gospel of achievement for nearly a century, Napoleon Hill. His book, Think and Grow Rich, has sold over 100 million copies. He wasn't just an author, he was presented as a chosen confidant, a Boswell to the industrial titans of his age. People who applied his principles: definiteness of purpose, the mastermind alliance, applied faith, going the extra mile, often found their lives transformed. On one hand, you have the sage, the mentor, the man whose words have ignited the ambition of millions and undeniably created vast amounts of wealth and success in the world. He arrived at Carnegie's opulent office, a place that symbolized the pinnacle of human achievement. The air itself must have felt different. For the first part of the interview, things went as expected. He'll ask the standard questions. How did you become so successful? What are the key principles of your success? Carnegie, in his characteristic direct manner, answered them. He spoke of hard work, of saving, of investing. But as the interview progressed, Hill claims something shifted. Carnegie began to look at him with a piercing gaze, as if he were measuring him, searching for something beyond the superficial questions of a reporter. The steel magnate saw, or so the story goes, a spark in the young man's eyes, a burning desire, a restless ambition that mirrored his own. And so, Carnegie decided to make an audacious gamble. He stopped the interview and changed the course of not only Napoleon Hill's life, but arguably the entire future of the self-help movement. His principles, when isolated from his personal story, are powerful, timeless, and effective. On the other hand, you have a figure shrouded in mystery and controversy, a man whose most famous claims appear to be built on a foundation of sand. It forces us to ask a difficult question that goes far beyond just one author. Does the messenger matter? If a philosophy can genuinely help people, does it become less valid if its creator was a deeply flawed or even dishonest individual? Can we, and should we, separate the art from the artist, the message from the messenger? This isn't just a historical investigation. It's a philosophical one. It's about how we choose our heroes, what we require from our mentors, and whether a useful lie is more valuable than a harsh truth. To even begin to answer that, we must travel back to the very beginning, to the origin story that started it all. It's a story that involves the richest man in the world, a stopwatch, and a life-altering question. We have to examine the foundational myth upon which the entire Napoleon Hill empire was built. The legendary commission from Andrew Carnegie himself. They started businesses, they got promotions, they overcame personal demons. It's a story that takes place in 1908. Imagine a young Napoleon Hill, just 25 years old. He is ambitious, hungry, and working as a journalist for a publication called Bob Taylor's Magazine. He is not yet the guru we know today. He is a fledgling writer looking for his big break, and he gets it. He secures an interview with the single most powerful and wealthiest man on the planet, Andrew Carnegie. At this point, Carnegie was a living legend, a Scottish immigrant who had arrived in America with nothing. He had built a steel empire that was the engine of the modern world. He had sold it for a sum so vast it is still difficult to comprehend, nearly $500 million in 1901, which would be many, many billions today. Now, in his later years, he had dedicated his life to philanthropy, but he remained a figure of almost mythical stature. For a young journalist like Hill, this wasn't just an interview. It was an audience with a king. The philosophy work, the sheer power and utility of the message seemed to be proof enough of the messenger's authenticity. But as time went on, as historians and investigative journalists began to dig deeper into the life of the man behind the myth, unsettling questions began to surface. These weren't just minor discrepancies. They were gaping holes in the very foundation of his life story. The whispers started to get louder. Rumors of failed businesses, of legal troubles, of outright fabrications. The man who wrote the definitive book on success seemed to have a personal history. marked by a startling amount of failure and flight. The man who preached unimpeachable integrity was accused of fraud. The man who claimed to be a trusted advisor to presidents had no record of ever meeting them in such a capacity. The names associated with him are a Mount Rushmore of American industry and innovation. Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate who supposedly gave him his life's mission. Henry Ford, the man who put the world on wheels. Thomas Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park. Theodore Roosevelt, the rugged president. Hill positioned himself as the humble journalist who was granted unprecedented access to these great minds, tasked with a single, monumental challenge: to distill their secrets into a philosophy that could be used by the common man. He was, by his own account, the maker of millionaires, the conduit through which the wisdom of the elite flowed to the masses. This narrative is intoxicatingly powerful. It gives the philosophy an almost divine authority. This isn't just Napoleon Hill's opinion. This is the collective, time-tested wisdom of the most successful men who ever lived. It's a story of a noble quest, of a 25-year mission undertaken not for personal gain, but for the betterment of all humanity. It's been translated into dozens of languages and has been a mentor and a book for presidents, CEOs, athletes, and millions of ordinary people who dared to dream of an extraordinary life. But behind this monumental legacy, there's a darker, more complex story, a story filled with whispers of fraud, glaring inconsistencies, and uncomfortable truths. Tonight we are going to pull back the curtain and ask a very serious question. Was Napoleon Hill the genius messenger who decoded the secrets of success for the masses? Or was he one of the most brilliant and successful con artists of the 20th century? This is the story of a man, a myth, and a message that changed the world. To understand the sheer scale of Napoleon Hill's influence, you have to understand the power of his central promise. He didn't just offer tips on how to make money. He offered a complete philosophy of life, a unified theory of success that was both mystical and brutally practical. To crack open, think, and grow rich for the first time is a rite of passage for many. It feels less like reading a book and more like being initiated into a secret society. Suddenly, the chaotic and often unfair world of success seems to have a formula. There are rules, there are principles, and most importantly, the power to master these rules lies not in your bank account, your social status, or your education, but entirely within the confines of your own mind. This was a revolutionary concept. He told the world that your thoughts, when mixed with definiteness of purpose, persistence, and a burning desire, can be transmuted into their physical equivalent. He wasn't just saying think positive. He was presenting a system, a step-by-step blueprint for bending reality to your will. The legend of Napoleon Hill is inseparable from the legends of the men he claimed as his mentors. And for decades, the world accepted this story as gospel. Why wouldn't they? The results spoke for themselves. This creates a profound and deeply uncomfortable paradox that sits at the heart of his legacy. How do we reconcile the two Napoleon Hills? The entire Napoleon Hill empire, the global phenomenon that has inspired generations, rests on the foundation of a single, extraordinary story. According to Hill's telling, the interview was scheduled for 3 hours. He leaned forward and shared a deep-seated belief, a concern that weighed heavily on his mind. He explained that his own success and the success of men like Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, and John D. Rockefeller was not due to luck or chance. He proposed that Hill dedicate the next 20 to 25 years of his life to a monumental task. He knew that great achievement requires a burning desire and a willingness to go the extra mile. He had passed the test. By making a rapid, definite decision, he had demonstrated one of the key principles of the very philosophy he was now tasked to organize. To dismiss his work outright is to ignore the undeniable genius and profound psychological insight woven into his principles. The message resonated for a simple reason. When applied, it produces results. On that foundation is perhaps Hill's most famous and revolutionary concept, the mastermind alliance. This idea alone has been responsible for the creation of countless businesses and fortunes. Hill defined the mastermind as the coordination of knowledge and effort in a spirit of harmony between two or more people for the attainment of a definite purpose. He understood a fundamental truth about human achievement: no one succeeds alone. We are all limited by our own knowledge, our own experience, and our own personal biases. A single mind, no matter how brilliant, has finite resources. But when you bring two or more minds together in a spirit of true harmony and cooperation, something magical happens. A third mind is created, the mastermind. This is not just about networking or getting advice. It's about a synergistic fusion of mental energy. It's what happens when one person's idea sparks a better idea in another, which is then refined and perfected by the group. The collective intelligence, creativity, and spiritual energy of the group far surpasses the sum of its individual parts. Hill didn't just write a book. He crafted a complete operating system for human ambition, and its core components are as relevant today as they were in the early 20th century. At the very heart of his entire philosophy is the concept he called definiteness of purpose. This is the starting point of all achievement. It sounds simple, but it's a principle of profound depth. Hill argued that the vast majority of people drift through life without ever truly deciding what they want. They have vague hopes, wishes, and daydreams. They hope for more money. They wish for a better job. They dream of being happy. But these are not definite purposes. They are passive desires. This story is the bedrock of Think and Grow Rich. It's not just a charming anecdote. It's the source of the book's authority. It's the act of selecting a single, clear, and specific goal and then focusing all of your mental and physical energy on its attainment. It's not just "I want to be wealthy." It is, as he instructed, "I will have in my possession, by January 1st, 5 years from now, the sum of $50,000, which will come to me in various amounts from time to time during the interim. In return for this money, I will give the most efficient service of which I am capable, in the capacity of a salesman of." You get the idea. It is specific. It is measurable. It has a deadline. And most importantly, it clarifies what you intend to give in return for what you get. This transforms a flimsy wish into a concrete plan. It acts as a psychological compass, a filter through which you make all of your decisions. It gives you a reason to wake up in the morning, a reason to say no to distractions, and a reason to persist when you face the inevitable setbacks. It's the difference between a ship floating aimlessly at sea and a ship with a rudder, a map, and a clear destination, steaming ahead with power and direction. It transforms Napoleon Hill from a mere author into a chosen disciple, a man who undertook a heroic, self-sacrificing quest for the good of humanity. The wisdom in the book isn't just his. It's the verified, collective wisdom of Carnegie, Ford, Edison, and hundreds more, all channeled through their chosen scribe. The power of this origin story cannot be overstated. It gives the philosophy an unimpeachable provenance. It makes the reader feel they are receiving a sacred text, a map to treasure handed down from the gods of industry. And for nearly a century, this dramatic, inspiring, and perfectly crafted story has been the first and most important principle that millions of readers have learned from Napoleon Hill. He wanted to see if this young, unknown journalist possessed that fire. So, after laying out this life-altering, unfunded, 20-year-long proposition, he pulled out a stopwatch from his vest pocket. He clicked it. "I have just given you your opportunity," Carnegie allegedly said. "I'm now going to time you. I want your answer, yes or no, in the next 60 seconds. Imagine the pressure of that moment. 60 seconds to decide the entire course of your life. On one hand, it was a fool's errand, a quarter century of unpaid labor with no guarantee of success at the end. It was a path of immense sacrifice and uncertainty. On the other hand, it was the chance of a lifetime, a mission blessed by the richest man in the world, an opportunity to walk with giants and uncover the most valuable secrets known to humankind. The seconds ticked by. 20, 30, 40. Hill described his mind racing, his heart pounding. And then, as he tells it, with 29 seconds still left on the stopwatch, he looked Andrew Carnegie in the eye and said, "Yes, sir, I accept. And you can bet that I will complete it." Carnegie would use his influence to open doors for Hill, providing him with letters of introduction to the most successful men in America, over 500 of them. Hill's task would be to interview these titans, to live with them, study them, and work alongside them. His singular goal would be to distill their collective wisdom, to find the common threads that ran through all their stories of success, and to organize these findings into the world's first ever philosophy of personal achievement. And then came the catch, the detail that elevates this story from a simple job offer to a heroic quest. Carnegie offered to do all of this, to open every door, on one condition. Hill had to do it all without any financial compensation from him. He would not be paid a single dollar for his time or his travel. He would have to support himself while undertaking this decade-long odyssey. It was a test. Carnegie wasn't just looking for a writer. He was looking for a man who lived by the very principles he was meant to uncover. It was the result of applying a specific, definable philosophy, a set of principles that could be taught, learned, and replicated. He called it the philosophy of achievement. But here was the problem. This philosophy had never been organized. It existed only in the actions, habits, and minds of the men who used it. Carnegie worried that this priceless knowledge, the very blueprint for success, would die with them. He felt a profound obligation to humanity to see it codified and shared with the world, to give every person, regardless of their station in life, a fair chance at achieving their dreams. And then, he turned his gaze directly on Napoleon Hill and made the proposal that would become the cornerstone of his legend. Carnegie offered Hill a mission. He didn't offer him a job. He offered him a sacred trust. This is the dramatic climax of the story. Carnegie, the master psychologist, understood the laws of success he was asking Hill to document. In that moment, Hill claimed that Carnegie's stern demeanor broke into a warm smile. Before we dive into the controversies, it's absolutely crucial to understand why Napoleon Hill's philosophy became and remains so incredibly powerful. Hill's genius was in framing a definite purpose as a non-negotiable command to your subconscious mind. Building. Think of the legendary partnerships that changed the world: Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, even the founding fathers of the United States, who Hill often cited as a perfect example of a mastermind group. They were all able to achieve things that would have been impossible for any one of them alone. He personified these forces almost as if they were living entities vying for control of your mind. They weren't victims of their circumstances or their anxieties. They were soldiers in a battle for their own minds. The principles of going the extra mile, doing more than you paid for to make yourself invaluable, and the law of cosmic habit force, the idea that our thoughts and actions create momentum, all combine to create a holistic system. This silence is deafening. Think about it. Hill claims the meeting happened in 1908. At that time, he was writing for a small, relatively obscure publication called Bob Taylor's Magazine. In his comprehensive 1931 biography, Incredible Carnegie, there is, once again, no mention of Napoleon Hill or this grand philosophical commission. The Carnegie Corporation of New York, the philanthropic foundation established by the man himself, has stated on the record that they have no evidence of any relationship between Hill and Carnegie. When author David Nasaw was writing his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, Andrew Carnegie, one of the most exhaustive and respected works on the man, he specifically looked for evidence of the Hill connection. He found nothing. He concluded that the story was, in all likelihood, an invention. So we are left with a stark reality. The foundational myth, the story that gives Think and Grow Rich its immense authority, crumbles under the slightest historical scrutiny. There are no letters. There are no records. There are no witnesses. There's no mention in Carnegie's own writings or in the works of his official biographers. The entire event seems to have been conjured out of thin air by Hill himself. A brilliant piece of marketing to lend credibility to his philosophy. When later questioned about Hill's claims, which began to gain traction after Carnegie's death in 1919, Winkler was dismissive. He, along with other Carnegie historians, could find no trace of the relationship Hill described. The story simply did not exist outside of Hill's own marketing materials. It's also important to note when Hill started telling this story. He didn't publicize the Carnegie Commission in 1908. He didn't write about it in the 1910s. It was only after Carnegie had been dead for many years, unable to confirm or deny the account, that the story began to take its central place in Hill's public persona. The timing is, to say the least, convenient. While he claimed it was part of a series of interviews with famous men, his documented output for the magazine was sparse. The idea that this unknown 25-year-old from rural Virginia could, on his own, secure a private, multi-hour interview with the most famous and protected industrialist in the world stretches credulity. Carnegie was besieged by requests. He had gatekeepers for his gatekeepers. Securing a brief audience was a major coup for the most powerful journalists of the day. The notion that he would grant an extended, life-altering meeting to a complete unknown is highly improbable. If you, as the world's richest man, had just commissioned a project of such profound importance to humanity, a project you believe would be your greatest legacy, wouldn't you mention it somewhere? Wouldn't there be a letter to a colleague, a note in a diary, a file in your office? The complete absence of Hill's name in any of Carnegie's personal or professional papers is the first, and perhaps most significant, piece of evidence against the story. The burden of proof, in this case, falls on the one making the extraordinary claim, and Hill never provided it. He never produced the letter of introduction Carnegie supposedly gave him. The entire event exists only in one place, Napoleon Hill's own telling of it. It was a philosophy that addressed both the inner and outer worlds. It gave you tools to reprogram your subconscious mind and practical strategies for navigating the external world of business and relationships. This is why it works. It's not just woo-woo positive thinking. It is a rigorous mental and strategic discipline. It's a call to action that demands self-examination, planning, and relentless persistence. The power of Hill's message is that it takes the esoteric and makes it practical. It takes the overwhelming concept of success and breaks it down into actionable, learnable steps. It's a message of profound empowerment, and it is this potent, life-changing message that makes the coming revelations about the messenger himself so deeply jarring and complicated. He argued that applied faith was the head chemist of the mind. There is only one glaring, monumental problem with it. There is absolutely no evidence that it ever happened. This isn't a minor discrepancy or a case of hazy memories. It's a foundational claim upon which he'll build his entire career. And it appears to be a complete fabrication. The first crack in this carefully constructed armor comes from the simple, yet damning, absence of any independent proof. Let's start with Andrew Carnegie himself. Carnegie was a meticulous record keeper and a prolific writer. His life is one of the most well-documented of the industrial age. We have his letters, his diaries, his business records, his philanthropic archives. The Andrew Carnegie archives are vast and have been scoured by historians for decades. And in that entire mountain of paper, there is not a single mention of Napoleon Hill, not one. There is no letter of introduction written for him. There is no record of a meeting in 1908. There is no mention of a grand 25-year mission to codify the philosophy of success. It wasn't a blind, religious faith, but a state of mind that could be cultivated through techniques like autosuggestion or what we might call affirmations today. By repeatedly telling your subconscious mind what you want to achieve, by visualizing it with emotion, you could develop an unshakable belief in your own ability to succeed. This faith, he said, was the eternal elixir that gives life, power, and action to the impulsive thought. It was the psychological fuel for persistence. On the other side of the battlefield were the six ghosts of fear. The fear of poverty, criticism, ill health, loss of love, old age, and death. Hill's brilliance was in identifying and naming these specific fears. forcing his readers to confront them directly. He treated them like enemies to be understood and defeated, not just vague anxieties to be endured. He argued that these fears were nothing more than states of mind, and because you have control over your own mind, you have the power to conquer them. Hill's framework for the mastermind was so powerful because it was practical. He gave rules for creating and maintaining it. Choose members who are in absolute harmony. Meet regularly. Maintain a singular, definite purpose for the group. He saw it as a way for an individual to borrow and use the education, experience, influence, and even the capital of other people. For the average person in the 1930s, who lacked formal education or financial backing, this was a revolutionary idea. It was a democratic principle of success. You didn't have to be the smartest person in the room. You just had to be smart enough to assemble the smartest people in the room and unite them toward a common goal. This principle gave people a tangible strategy for overcoming their personal limitations. Furthermore, Hill's philosophy was infused with a deep understanding of human psychology, particularly the battle between faith and fear. This framework gave people a sense of agency over their internal world. The story of the Andrew Carnegie Commission is magnificent. It's inspiring. It's the perfect narrative engine to drive a philosophy of success. The man who supposedly gave Hill his life's purpose and set him on a historic quest never once wrote down his name. But the evidence against the story goes beyond a simple lack of corroboration. The chronology and the details just don't add up. Furthermore, Carnegie's official biographer, a man named John K. Winkler, conducted extensive research and interviews with Carnegie's closest associates and family. The official keepers of Carnegie's legacy have also weighed in. This is more than just a white lie or a bit of harmless embellishment. It fundamentally changes how we view Napoleon Hill. He didn't just tell a story. He built an identity on it. He claimed the authority of Andrew Carnegie as his own. According to his legend, this should have been the start of his great mission. After the collapse of the Automobile College, Hill moved to Chicago. He started advertising agencies. He started magazines, like Hill's Golden Rule. The author who preached the importance of unimpeachable integrity and going the extra mile was, in his real life, a man who was indicted for fraud and who ran from the law. In a way, his life of constant hustle and reinvention was his own kind of education. Then his claims about his professional life were the pillars meant to hold the whole structure up. Hill didn't just claim to be a student of the great, he claimed to be one of them, a trusted advisor in the highest echelons of power and academia. He constructed a resume for himself that was as impressive as it was fictitious. Two of his most prominent and frequently repeated claims were that he was a lawyer and that he had served as an advisor to two United States presidents, Woodrow Wilson and Franklin D. Roosevelt. These claims were not footnotes. They were central to his credibility. They positioned him as a man of intellect, influence, and patriotic importance. And just like the Carnegie story, they fall apart under basic scrutiny. He was becoming a master of one thing, selling himself. Hill often referred to himself as attorney at law and let others introduce him as such. He even founded a George Washington Institute of Law, lending further credence to the idea that he was a legal scholar. In the early 20th century, having the title of attorney conveyed a sense of gravitas, intelligence, and ethical standing. It was a powerful tool for a man trying to sell a philosophy based on principles and laws. The problem is, there is no record whatsoever of Napoleon Hill ever having graduated from a law school or having been admitted to the bar in any state. Historians and investigators who have meticulously searched the rolls of law schools, he might have attended, like Georgetown and the bar associations of Washington, D.C., Illinois, and other states where he lived, have found no trace of him. He was no more a lawyer than he was the commissioned disciple of Andrew Carnegie. He was learning how to craft a compelling narrative, how to win people's trust quickly, and how to tap into their deepest desires for wealth and success. He was, in effect, field testing the very psychological principles he would later formalize. He was learning what people wanted to hear, and he was becoming exceptionally good at telling them those things. But the motivation seems to have been less about a noble quest for humanity and more about personal survival. He wasn't studying success to help others. He was trying to figure out how to achieve it for himself, and he was failing repeatedly and spectacularly. This history doesn't necessarily invalidate the principles in his book, but it completely shatters the myth of the man himself. He wasn't a divinely chosen messenger. He was a struggling, deeply flawed individual who, after decades of failure, finally struck gold by packaging and selling a philosophy that he himself had struggled to live by. The Carnegie story wasn't just a lie. It was a necessary lie to cover up a past that would have otherwise made his claims to be a success expert utterly laughable. The man who wrote about the importance of persistence was an expert at abandoning failed projects and starting anew somewhere else. The man who taught the world how to accumulate riches had a personal financial history that was, for decades, a complete and utter disaster. He was constantly in debt, constantly scrambling for money, and constantly leaving others holding the bag. It's a staggering contradiction. The guru of success was, by any objective measure, a serial failure. Each one would launch with a flurry of grand promises and testimonials, often invoking the names of famous men he claimed to know, but they would inevitably collapse, often leaving behind a trail of unpaid bills and angry investors. One particularly notable venture was the Interwall Institute, a foundation he created to provide educational materials to prisoners in Ohio. Again, it sounds noble. But according to a 2016 investigation by Gizmodo journalist Matt Novak, who unearthed many of these forgotten stories, the institute also fell apart under a cloud of financial suspicion. It was a recurring cycle, a grand vision, a charismatic launch, followed by financial trouble, accusations of wrongdoing, and a quiet disappearance. Here, he embarked on a new scheme, one that would land him in even more serious trouble. He started a candy business, the Betsy Ross Candy Shop, but his real venture was what he did on the side. In 1915, he was indicted on charges of stock fraud. The allegations, documented in the Cook County, Illinois, criminal court records, were serious. Hill and a partner were accused of attempting to sell stock in their lumber company at a valuation far exceeding its actual worth, a classic stock watering scheme. They were accused of trying to defraud an investor of thousands of dollars. Faced with these criminal charges, Hill did not stay to fight them and prove his innocence, a principle of integrity he would later write about. Instead, he fled. He skipped town, leaving his partner to face the music, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. For the next several years, Napoleon Hill was, legally speaking, a fugitive. In reality, Hill was in Washington, D.C., where he founded a business called the Automobile College of Washington. His plan was to teach students how to build, chauffeur, and sell cars. On paper, it was a timely idea, but the execution was fraught with issues. The college was soon facing serious allegations. According to newspaper reports from the time, including articles in the Washington Post, Hill was accused of fraudulent practices. The company was accused of misrepresenting the quality of its cars and its facilities to both students and investors. The venture collapsed in 1912 amidst a flurry of lawsuits and negative press. This was not the work of a man quietly interviewing industrial titans. This was the work of a hustler whose grand promises failed to materialize. He presented himself not as the author of a philosophy, but as its chosen scribe, its ordained messenger. This initial deception forces us to look at everything else he claimed with a far more critical eye. If he was willing to fabricate the very origin of his life's work, what else was he willing to fabricate? This first crack in the armor doesn't just damage the facade, it shatters it, revealing a much more complex and troubling history beneath. It's the first thread you pulled that begins to unravel the entire tapestry of the man, the myth, and the legend. And as we will see, this was not a one-time deception. It was part of a lifelong pattern of behavior that involved fraud, failure, and a remarkable talent for reinvention. The Carnegie story was not the exception. It was the rule. If the fabricated Carnegie story was an isolated incident, we might be able to dismiss it as a shrewd marketing tactic, a useful lie designed to help a powerful message reach more people. But it wasn't an isolated incident. When you dig into the life of Napoleon Hill before the publication of Think and Grow Rich in 1937, what you find is not the story of a dedicated scholar on a noble 25-year quest. Instead, you find a trail of chaos, a pattern of failed business ventures, serious accusations of fraud, and periods where he was, by all accounts, a fugitive from the law. This isn't a hidden history. It's a documented one, unearthed by journalists and historians who were willing to look past the official biography. This pattern of behavior casts the philosophy of success in a deeply ironic light, as its creator seemed to be living a life that was the polar opposite of the principles he would later preach. Let's go back to the period right after his supposed 1908 meeting with Carnegie. The pattern repeated itself, but with escalating severity. During this period, he constantly reinvented himself. He moved from town to town, often using variations of his name, and started new ventures. This history is profoundly at odds with the man who wrote Think and Grow Rich. This isn't to say that he wasn't learning anything during this time. If the fabricated Carnegie story was the foundation of the Napoleon Hill myth, and his history of business failures and fraud accusations was the inconvenient truth it was designed to hide, let's first examine the claim of being an attorney. This wasn't just a harmless title he gave himself. It was part of his sales pitch. This was perhaps the crown jewel of his embellished resume. According to Hill, during World War I, he was personally brought in by President Woodrow Wilson to help with the war effort. His specific role? It's a paraphrase of a line from the writer and philosopher Henry David Thoreau, and it was worked into the speech by FDR's own team of speechwriters, most notably Lewis Howe. It wasn't enough to have a powerful philosophy. He needed to be seen as a powerful man himself. He wasn't content to be the messenger. He had to be the confidant of kings and presidents. One of the most significant was his foray into the lumber business in West Virginia and Virginia. It appears that Price, in his capacity as a journalist, had begun to investigate Hill's business practices. What we know for sure is that W.E. Price was shot and killed. He claimed that Price was trying to blackmail him, and that the shooting was a matter of self-defense on the part of his associate, Strader. He painted himself as a respectable businessman being harassed by a corrupt journalist. However, his actions following the incident are highly suspect. Just as he had done in Chicago when faced with fraud charges, Hill's primary response was to flee. He did not stay to clear his name or to help his associate's legal defense. He left the area, effectively abandoning the situation and further fueling suspicion about his involvement. Butler Strader was eventually acquitted of the murder charge, but the cloud of suspicion around Napoleon Hill remained. The alleged shooter was a man named Butler L. Strader, who was an associate and relative of Napoleon Hill's. Strader was arrested and charged with the murder. This is where Napoleon Hill's role becomes critically important and deeply suspicious. According to some accounts, Hill was present at or near the scene of the crime. The motive for the murder, as argued by the prosecution, was directly related to the feud between Hill and the deceased editor. The theory was that Price was killed to silence him, to stop his investigation into Hill's business affairs. The murder was not a random act of violence. It was a consequence of the corner businessman's desperation. He was likely looking into the financial solvency of Hill's lumber operation and questioning the legitimacy of his dealings. In essence, he was doing his job as a small-town newspaperman, holding a newcomer with big promises accountable. This scrutiny from the local press was a direct threat to Hill's business, which, like his others, likely relied on maintaining a facade of success and credibility to attract investors and credit. The situation escalated, turning into a bitter and public feud between the two men. He positioned himself as a timber magnate, the head of the Napoleon Hill Lumber Company. According to his own later accounts, he was highly successful, amassing a small fortune. But like many of his claims, this is highly dubious. The more plausible story, pieced together from local records and newspaper archives, is one of a business operating on shaky financial ground, fueled by credit and grand promises. It was during this period that Hill became entangled in a dispute that would end in tragedy. This systematic embellishment of his own life story paints a picture of a man who was deeply insecure, a man who felt that his own achievements, or lack thereof, were not enough. He had to borrow the achievements and status of others. The irony is staggering. The man who taught that you could achieve anything you could conceive and believe was, in his own life, unwilling to rely on his own true story. He felt the need to invent a better one, a more glamorous one, a more important one. And this tendency toward the fantastic and the fabricated would eventually lead him into even stranger territory, moving from professional lies to mystical claims that bordered on the bizarre. Hill simply co-opted it after the fact, a brazen attempt to attach his name to a famous and powerful idea. The claim about Woodrow Wilson is equally baseless. Hill did create some patriotic materials during the war, as many publishers did. But the idea that he was a personal advisor to the president is a fantasy. He was a master of what we might call credibility by association. He understood that if he simply repeated a claim boldly and often enough, especially one involving a figure who was no longer around to deny it, people would eventually believe it. To create propaganda and promotional materials, and to help craft the famous 14-point speech, he claimed to have worked so closely with the president that he was a regular fixture at the White House. It's a story that involves a lumber business, accusations of financial misdeeds, and a violent crime that left a man dead. This episode, which took place in and around 1913, is confusing, murky, and filled with conflicting accounts, mostly from Hill himself. But what is clear is that it represents a significant escalation from simple stock fraud or business failures into something far more sinister. It's a part of his history that he rarely spoke of, and when he did, his version of events changed dramatically over time, a classic sign of someone trying to control a damaging narrative. Later, he would make a similar claim about President Franklin D. Roosevelt, asserting that it was he who fed FD, or the iconic line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," for his first inaugural address. These are breathtaking claims. They don't just place him in the room where it happened. They place him at the very center of history, whispering the words that would define presidencies and shape the course of the 20th century. For example, when he was promoting his magazine, Hill's Golden Rule, he would often leverage this inerrant title to give his pronouncements a sense of legal and ethical weight. The White House keeps meticulous daily logs, appointment books, and correspondence records. Napoleon Hill's name does not appear in the records for either the Wilson or the Roosevelt administrations in any advisory capacity. The historians and biographers of these presidents, men who have dedicated their lives to studying every facet of their careers, have found no evidence of Hill's involvement. The idea that an obscure magazine publisher, an aspiring motivational speaker, a man with a spotty business record at best, would be called upon to advise a wartime president on foreign policy, or to coin the most famous phrase of another president's inaugural address is frankly absurd. It made him seem more authoritative, more trustworthy. The George Washington Institute that he founded wasn't a real academic institution. In the way we understand it, like many of his ventures, it was primarily a business, one that eventually faded away. The claim of being a lawyer was a complete fabrication, an embellishment designed to bolster his public image and make him appear more qualified than he was. It is a classic con artist trick. Borrow the credibility of a respected profession to enhance your own. Even more audacious were his claims of being a presidential advisor. As you might expect by now, there is zero evidence to support any of this. The line "the only thing we have to fear is fear itself" has a well-documented origin, and it has nothing to do with Napoleon Hill. This pattern of building a false resume reveals a deep-seated need in Hill not just for success, but for status and importance. While the stories of fabricated credentials and failed businesses paint a picture of a chronic embellisher and a struggling entrepreneur, there is another, darker chapter in Napoleon Hill's early life that is far more disturbing. After fleeing Chicago to escape the 1915 stock fraud indictment, Hill had already been involved in a series of questionable ventures. The central conflict involved a man named W.E. Price, who was the editor of a local newspaper. The details of what happened next are the subject of intense debate. Hill, of course, presented a very different story. In his version, he was the innocent victim. In later years, when he would occasionally refer to this period, his story would shift. Sometimes he was a wealthy lumber baron, sometimes he was the victim of a smear campaign. It adds a layer of genuine darkness to his character, the man who would later write about the power of harmony and the importance of a positive mental attitude was, at one point in his life, entangled in a situation that ended with a man's death. He would close his eyes and see them seated around a council table with him. He flirted with the idea that he was tapping into some universal ether, a cosmic consciousness where the knowledge of these great men was stored. To a modern, secular reader, this sounds like a powerful psychological exercise in creative visualization, a way to model the traits of successful people. There was a sacred text, Think and Grow Rich. There was a specialized language, masterminds, infinite intelligence, auto-suggestion, and there was often a significant financial commitment required to gain access to the higher levels of teaching through seminars and courses. People were encouraged to sever ties with negative friends and family members who didn't subscribe to the philosophy, a classic isolation tactic used in high-control groups. The promise was total transformation, but the demand was total devotion to the system. While many people undoubtedly benefited from the structure and motivation these programs provided, others felt exploited, describing a culture of psychological pressure where any failure was always the individual's fault for not applying the principles correctly. Never a flaw in the philosophy itself, but too many of his followers, and perhaps to Hill himself, it was presented as something more. It was a form of spiritual communion, a genuine channeling of wisdom from the great minds of the past. This blurring of the line between psychological technique and supernatural event became a hallmark of his later work. He spoke of infinite intelligence as a tangible force that could be contacted, a cosmic reservoir of all knowledge that one could tap into, much like a radio receiver tuning into a specific frequency. He, as the chairman, would call upon each member for the knowledge he wished them to contribute. In the 1950s and 60s, working alongside W. Clement Stone, a wealthy insurance magnate, Hill's philosophy became the foundation of a massive sales training organization, the Napoleon Hill Foundation was created, and his teachings were promoted with an almost religious fervor. The rhetoric was often absolutist. His 17 principles of success were not just good ideas. They were presented as the infallible, scientific laws of the universe. Adherence to them would guarantee success, while ignoring them would condemn you to failure. This created a high-control, high-pressure environment for many people involved in his programs. For example, he would turn to Abraham Lincoln and say, "Mr. Lincoln, I desire to draw from you the spirit of patience, justice, and fairness with which you dealt with your fellow men." He would ask Napoleon Bonaparte for the spirit of strategic leadership and Thomas Edison for the spirit of persistence. He claimed that these imaginary meetings became so vividly real that he grew afraid of them. The figures began to take on distinct personalities and would sometimes show up to his meetings uninvited. He wrote that he became so unnerved by the realism of the experience that he discontinued the practice for several months. He eventually resumed, but with a more sane and rational understanding that these figures were manifestations of his own subconscious mind. It demonstrates the extreme pressure he was under and the chaotic nature of his life. Before he found a more legitimate way to make his fortune by selling philosophy. The lumber baron story is a chilling reminder that behind the inspirational quotes and the best-selling books, there was a man with a complicated and shadowy past. A past that he spent the rest of his life trying to rewrite, repackage, and ultimately escape. He never offered a clear, consistent account of what happened to his business, the nature of his dispute with Price, or his exact role in the events leading up to the murder. If his early life was characterized by fabricated professional claims, his later life was marked by a turn towards the supernatural. He began to speak less like a business strategist and more like a spiritual guru, introducing concepts that went far beyond positive thinking and into the realm of the paranormal. The most famous and strangest of these concepts was his cabinet of invisible counselors. This wasn't a metaphor. Hill claimed that every night, before he went to sleep, he would hold a council meeting in his imagination with a group of historical figures whom he most admired. His cabinet was a who's who of genius: Lincoln, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emerson, Paine, Edison, Darwin, and others. This entire episode is a black hole in his biography. It's a story of violence and suspicion that stands in stark contrast to the benevolent, philosophical image he would later cultivate. It suggests that Hill was not just a simple con man who exaggerated his resume. He was potentially a man capable of associating with and being at the center of extreme violence when his financial interests were threatened. This mysterious and violent chapter is crucial for understanding the depths of his early struggles and the lengths he might have gone to protect himself and his ventures. As Napoleon Hill aged and his fame grew, his philosophy began to take on an increasingly mystical, and to some, a bizarre dimension. He described the process in vivid detail in Think and Grow Rich. However, his later writings suggest he may have come to believe something more was at play. This esoteric turn led to serious accusations, particularly in his later years, that he was operating something akin to a cult. Critics pointed to the cult-like characteristics of the movement. There was a charismatic, infallible leader Hill. This esoteric and quasi-religious aspect of his work culminated in the posthumous publication of a book he allegedly wrote in 1938, but was considered too controversial to release. Outwitting the Devil. In this book, Hill conducts a long, fantastical interview with the devil himself. The devil, in this context, is not a religious figure with horns and a pitchfork, but a metaphor for the negative forces that hold humanity back. The devil's primary tool is drifting, the act of going through life without a definite purpose. If a mathematical formula is discovered by a scoundrel, does it make the formula any less accurate? What matters is what he produced. He may have been a flawed vessel, but he delivered a priceless cargo. He was a synthesizer of genius. This perspective argues that the messenger and the message are inextricably linked, especially when the message is a philosophy for living. The authority of Think and Grow Rich is derived almost entirely from the claim that it represents the distilled wisdom of 500 of the world's most successful men, a study commissioned by Andrew Carnegie. If the central premise is a lie, then the entire book is presented under false pretenses. It's no longer a sacred text of verified wisdom. It's a brilliant piece of marketing by a very clever salesman. The message is no longer "this is what Andrew Carnegie and Henry Ford believed." It's "this is what Napoleon Hill, a man with a history of deception, wants you to believe." This context changes everything. It encourages us not to accept the principles at face value, but to question them, to ask why he wanted us to believe them. Was it for our benefit or for his? When an author is not just presenting data, but is teaching you how to live a life of integrity, achievement, and purpose, their own life becomes Exhibit A. Their character is their credibility. If the man teaching you about the importance of unimpeachable integrity was himself indicted for fraud and built his career on a lie, the message itself becomes tainted. It's not just hypocritical, it's deceptive. It suggests that the real secret to success isn't the noble philosophy he's selling you, but the underlying, unspoken philosophy of do whatever it takes, including lying and cheating, to get ahead. Perhaps it took a man with his unique, chaotic, and desperate history to recognize and codify these laws of success. Perhaps his own lifelong struggle with failure gave him a unique insight into the mechanics of achievement. One could argue that his personal life, far from invalidating his work, is the very crucible in which the work was forged. He wasn't an academic studying success from an ivory tower. He was a man in the trenches, fighting for his life, and the principles he wrote about were the weapons he discovered along the way. Therefore, to discard the message because of the messenger's flaws is to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It is to deny ourselves access to a powerful set of tools, simply because we don't approve of the man who created them. If a beautiful piece of music is composed by a terrible person, does it make the melody any less beautiful? The proponents of this view would say no. The value of an idea is inherent in the idea itself and its logic, its utility, and its ability to produce results. In the case of Napoleon Hill, the proof is in the pudding. For nearly a century, people from all walks of life have picked up Think and Grow Rich, applied its principles, and seen tangible, positive changes in their lives. They didn't need Napoleon Hill to be a saint. They just needed his system to work. He uses fear, procrastination, and negative influences to control the 98% of people who do take charge of their own minds. While framed as a metaphor, the book is deeply strange. It's written as a literal dialogue, with Hill interrogating the devil to extract the secrets of how he manipulates humanity. It cemented his image as a man who didn't just understand success, but who had journeyed into the very heart of darkness to wrestle with the fundamental forces of good and evil. Whether you view these developments as the profound insights of a spiritual master or the bizarre ramblings of an aging showman, they represent the ultimate evolution of his persona. He had moved from a journalist to a success coach to a presidential advisor, and finally, to a mystic who conversed with spirits and interrogated the devil. This journey into the esoteric further complicates his legacy. Was this the genuine spiritual evolution of a man who had dedicated his life to studying the mind? Or was it the final, most audacious marketing strategy of a master salesman? Realizing that in America, nothing sells quite as well as a blend of capitalism and spirituality. It's in this murky space between philosophy, psychology, and the paranormal that the modern debate about hell truly lies. So now we arrive at the central, unavoidable conflict. On one side, we have the man, a figure whose history is riddled with fabricated credentials, failed businesses, accusations of fraud, a flight from the law, and a connection to a violent crime. A man who built his entire empire on a foundational myth about Andrew Carnegie that is, by all credible accounts, a complete invention. On the other side, we have the message, a philosophy of success so powerful, so resonant, and so effective that it has undeniably changed millions of lives for the better. The principles of having a definite purpose, forming a mastermind alliance, developing unwavering faith, and persisting in the face of failure are not just motivational platitudes. They are potent, actionable strategies that have empowered people to escape poverty, build empires, and achieve their wildest dreams. This is the great paradox of Napoleon Hill, and it forces us to ask one of the most difficult questions we can ask about any creator. Can we, and should we, separate the message from the messenger? Let's first argue the case for the separation. This perspective suggests that truth is truth, regardless of its source. From this viewpoint, Hill's personal failings are little more than a historical footnote, an interesting but ultimately irrelevant detail. Now, let's argue the other side, the case against separation. From this viewpoint, Hill's fabrications are not minor embellishments, they are a fundamental betrayal of the reader's trust. This perspective argues that ignoring the messenger's flaws is intellectually lazy and morally hazardous. It allows us to be seduced by a compelling narrative without doing the critical work of examining its source. It makes us vulnerable to charismatic charlatans who can package powerful ideas for their own personal gain. If we celebrate Hill's message while turning a blind eye to his methods, what are we implicitly endorsing? Are we saying that the ends justify the means? If Napoleon Hill, the struggling entrepreneur with a shady past, had written a book in 1937 titled My Opinions on How to Get Rich, who would have bought it? It would have been instantly forgettable, just another voice in a sea of get-rich-quick schemes. But by claiming the authority of Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, and Thomas Edison, he performed a masterful act of psychological transference. The unvarnished truth might be far less potent. Imagine an alternative preface to the book. Hi, I'm Napoleon Hill. A traditional con artist takes your money and gives you nothing of value in return. But Hill took the price of a book and gave millions of people a system that, for many, genuinely created value in their lives. He was more like a showman, A.P.T. Barnum of the self-help world. He understood that people don't just want information, they want an experience. They want to be part of a grand narrative. He built a magnificent theater, and the price of admission was believing in the myth of his life. Inside the theater, people found tools and inspiration that they used to build better lives. Does the fact that the theater was built with a fabricated foundation make the work they did inside it any less real? This is the complex legacy of his great lie. It was a deception, but it was a deception in service of a message that contained a powerful, and for many, a transformational truth. I've failed in dozens of businesses. I was once indicted for fraud, and I have a talent for exaggerating. Was he a true original, a lone genius who conceived these 17 principles of success out of thin air? The answer, much like the rest of his life story, is more complex. The truth is that Napoleon Hill was less of an inventor and more of a brilliant synthesizer. He was a master packager and popularizer of a powerful philosophical movement that was already well established long before he came onto the scene. That movement was called New Thought. Understanding New Thought is the key to unlocking the true origin of Hill's ideas and recognizing his real, and still formidable, genius. But along the way, I've read a lot of philosophy and synthesized some ideas that I think might help you. Give them a shot. Would that book have sold 100 million copies? Would it have inspired the same unwavering devotion? Almost certainly not. The raw truth is messy, complicated, and uninspiring. The myth is clean, heroic, and incredibly motivational. Hill, the master salesman, understood this better than anyone. He wasn't just selling a philosophy, he was selling a story. And the story was his most powerful product. The book was no longer his opinion. It was a scientific, 25-year study of certified geniuses. The Carnegie myth laundered Hill's credibility. It took his messy, questionable personal history and erased it, replacing it with a heroic narrative of selfless dedication. It transformed him from a salesman into a sage, from a hustler into a historian. The story was the ultimate mastermind alliance, with Hill forming a posthumous partnership with the greatest minds of the previous generation. That it's okay to lie and fabricate as long as the product you're selling is helpful. Humans are wired for stories, not for abstract principles. Have a definite purpose is a dry command. But a story about a young journalist being tested by the world's richest man with a stopwatch, accepting a life-altering mission in under 60 seconds, that's a legend. It's dramatic, it's memorable, and it beautifully illustrates the very principle of definite decision that Hill wanted to teach. The Carnegie story isn't just a preface to the philosophy, it is the first lesson. It primes the reader to believe in the power of bold, decisive action because the hero of the story, the author himself, embodies it. By buying into the myth, you are already practicing the first steps of the philosophy before you've even gotten to chapter 1. This is a dangerous precedent. It erodes the value of truth and integrity, the very qualities that Hill himself claimed to champion. For the average person struggling through the Great Depression, the idea that they could think their way to riches must have seemed preposterous. It would have been easy to dismiss it as wishful thinking. But the Carnegie myth provides a crucial piece of social proof. It says, don't just take my word for it. This is the secret formula used by the most successful men who ever lived. It's been tested and proven at the highest levels. This isn't magic, it's science. This framing bypasses our natural skepticism. It allows us to suspend our disbelief and engage with the ideas with the applied faith that Hill insisted was necessary for them to work. The lie, therefore, becomes a catalyst for the faith required to make the principles effective. It's a psychological placebo. The story itself might be sugar water, but if you believe it's powerful medicine, it can trigger a real healing response in your life. The message can't be fully trusted because the man who delivered it proved himself to be fundamentally untrustworthy. Ultimately, there is no easy answer. Both arguments have merit. The philosophy does work for many people, and his personal life was deeply compromised. Perhaps the most mature approach is not to choose one side, but to hold both realities in tension. We can acknowledge the utility of the principles while simultaneously recognizing the flawed and deceptive nature of their creator. This allows us to approach his work not as disciples accepting gospel, but as discerning students. We can take what is useful to actionable strategies for goal setting, persistence, and mental discipline while discarding the myth and the cult of personality that surrounds the man. It requires us to engage in critical thinking, the very skill that Hill, ironically, claimed to promote. It means we have to do the work of separating the timeless principles from the tall tales of the man who sold them to the world. To truly understand the enduring power of Napoleon Hill, we have to look deeper into the most significant lie he ever told the Carnegie Commission and ask a very uncomfortable question. What if the lie was the most important part? What if the myth, in its own strange way, is more powerful and more useful than the truth? This brings us to the concept of the noble lie or the useful myth, an idea that philosophers have debated for centuries. A useful myth is a story that is not factually true, but which promotes a beneficial outcome for individuals or society. It's a narrative that inspires us to be better, to strive for more, and to believe in something greater than ourselves, even if the story itself is a fiction. And the story of the 25-year Carnegie Commission is perhaps one of the most effective useful myths. In modern history, let's dissect why the fabrication is so brilliant from a psychological standpoint. First, it solves the problem of authority. Second, the myth provides a powerful narrative hook that makes the philosophy itself more compelling and easier to absorb. Third, and perhaps most profoundly, the myth gives the reader permission to believe. This creates a deeply uncomfortable but fascinating paradox. It is possible that the principles of Think and Grow Rich are far more effective precisely because they are packaged in a lie. So, when we call Hill a con artist, we might be missing the point. If Napoleon Hill didn't get his philosophy from a 25-year-long Carnegie-funded study of 500 great men, then where did it come from? The final verdict must be a nuanced one. A balance sheet with heavy entries in both the credit and debit columns. On the credit side, the positive impact of his work is undeniable. The philosophy he popularized, regardless of its true origin, contains a core of empowering and life-altering truth. The most enlightened path forward is to view Napoleon Hill not as a guru to be blindly followed, but as a complex historical figure to be critically studied. It's about our desperate desire for a formula for success, our hunger for certainty in an uncertain world, and our vulnerability to charismatic leaders who promise us a secret key to the universe. Hill was a mirror, reflecting our own deepest hopes and fears back at us. His success reveals our willingness to believe in a good story, sometimes even when we suspect it might not be true. His flaws remind us of the critical importance of questioning our heroes and looking past the packaging to examine the product itself. We can, and should, separate the principles from the persona. We can adopt the useful strategies from his work without worshiping at the altar of the man. He was a flawed man who stumbled upon a powerful truth. The most valuable real estate in the world is the 6 inches between your own 2 ears. He may not have always been honest about how he came to the conclusion, but the conclusion itself remains a source of immense power. The ultimate lesson from the life of Napoleon Hill, then, is perhaps the most important principle he never wrote down. Think for yourself. Question everything. Take what is useful. Discard what is not. and build your own philosophy of success based on truth, integrity, and the hard-won lessons of your own experience. That is a legacy far richer and more enduring than any fabricated tale of titans and tycoons. This requires a level of discernment that Hill himself did not always encourage in his followers. It means reading Think and Grow Rich not as a sacred text, but as a historical document, a brilliant synthesis of new thought philosophy packaged for a mass audience by a master salesman. We can admire his genius as a marketer and a systematizer without endorsing his deceptions. We can use his tools without believing his myths. The idea that we are not victims of our circumstances but creators of our reality is one of the most powerful ideas a human being can adopt. His principles of setting clear goals, of persisting through failure, of surrounding oneself with brilliant people, and of controlling one's own mental attitude, these are timeless pillars of achievement. For millions of people, Think and Grow Rich has been the spark that ignited their ambition, the roadmap that guided them out of despair, and the toolkit they used to build a life of purpose and prosperity. To deny this incredible positive impact would be cynical and dishonest. He packaged hope in a way that was accessible and actionable, and that hope has generated a measurable good in the world. However, on the debit side of the ledger, the costs of his methods are equally real. His life story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the seductive power of a good story. He built his authority on a foundation of lies, from the grand myth of the Carnegie Commission to the petty embellishments about being a lawyer and a presidential advisor. This fundamental dishonesty taints his legacy and forces us to approach his work with a healthy dose of skepticism. He modeled a version of success where the ends justify the means, where personal branding is more important than personal integrity. The more cult-like aspects of his later career serve as a warning about how easily empowerment philosophies can morph into high-control ideologies, demanding devotion rather than encouraging independent thought. The messenger matters, and Hill's character was, by any objective measure, deeply flawed. So, how do we reconcile this? Ultimately, the story of Napoleon Hill is not really about Napoleon Hill. It's about us. Was he a genius or a grifter? He was a grifter with a touch of genius.